her field, her area of expertise, and she's very good at it. So without further ado, here's Miss Ashley Galetta.
Hey everyone. So, the first thing that we're going to do is talk a little bit about what is language and what is speech before we can talk about how either of those things can be impaired. So, language is a rule based method of communication involving the comprehension and use of signs and symbols by which ideas are represented. So, when you look at this figure, you can see that language is broken up into three main areas. You have form, which is basically grammar. You have content, which is vocabulary. And then you have use, which is pragmatics or social skills and how language is used. And we're going to talk about all five areas. So, form or grammar has three main areas: phonology, morphology, and syntax. So the first one that we're going to discuss is phonology. Phonology looks at how we systematically organize sounds in language, and every language is different, so we're just going to talk about some phonological processes that we have in English. So here are a list of many different phonological processes that occur in our language. On the left-hand side, you see stopping, fronting, all the way down to initial consonant deletion. Those are the different processes. And on the right-hand side, you can see some different examples. So if you look at stopping, the example is shirt turns into turt. So what happened there is the continuous sound of sh turned into a stopping sound. So we call that stopping. Another example, if you go down to cluster reduction, you see on the right-hand side that star became tar. So that consonant cluster of ST was dropped. The first consonant S was dropped to become tar. So we call that consonant cluster reduction. So star, tar. And another example down at the bottom, initial consonant deletion, bat became at. That first consonant was just deleted. Now, these processes are developmentally appropriate when you're very young, and you start to see them fall off as you get older. So when kids are around age 3, a lot of these start to fall off. By the time they're age 4, you really don't see them present anymore. And full-grown adults don't have any of these phonological processes. When you have a kiddo or an adult who still has these, that's when we say that that part of their language is impaired, that they have a phonological process disorder. Now, at the very bottom of the screen, I made a little note that this is not to be confused with a common lisp or kids who have trouble making the R sound. Those are going to be articulation disorders that we'll discuss later. Again, phonological process disorders really involve the organizing and patterns of sounds in the brain. Here's a nice little table, and you can see at the very top that we've already discussed phonology. The next part that is under form is morphology. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Morphology, the definition is the rules governing how words are formed from the basic element of meaning. So we're going to talk about understanding grammatical structure of words and the use of grammar in words. So to talk about morphology, let's take the verb to snore in the infinitive form. Well, we can change it by adding different morphemes. So you have snoring. So if you add the ing, you can talk about it in the present tense. You could change it again to put an ed and talk about it in the past tense, snored, or es, he snores, she snores, or er, one who snores. So all those different endings that you see in blue we call morphemes. That is how a word changes or morphs from one way to another. When kids have a delay or a disorder with morphology, they often either use the wrong ending or they completely omit an ending when they're speaking. So back to looking at this chart, the last and third area of form is syntax. Syntax is rules for how to string words together to form phrases and sentences, and it deals with the relationships among the elements of a sentence. So again, under the area of form, you have phonology, morphology, and syntax. Phonology deals with the sound, morphology is at the word level, and then syntax is going to be at the phrase and sentence level. Kids who have difficulty with syntax are going to basically have, when they're using phrases and sentences, it's just not going to sound right. They might be leaving off pronouns. They might have their word structures are going to be different, where they might, instead of saying, he went to the store yesterday, they might say, He went yesterday to the store. It's gonna sound very different. Like different words could be omitted. The structure isn't going to sound like a typical adult speaker. And here's just a cute little cartoon that you can read over to the left. And this just demonstrates how the way that we put words together to create phrases and sentences can often be difficult for the speaker, but confusing for the person who is trying to comprehend what's being said. So we've completed looking at form or grammar, and the next area is semantics or content. And I like to think about semantics as vocabulary. Their definition is the linguistic realization of what the speaker knows about the world and the meanings of words and sentences. Um, on a comprehension level, it's understanding word meanings and word relationships. And on an expressive level, it's using those word meanings and word relationships. Here's just a cute little cartoon, You Rock, You Rule. When you have a child who has difficulty in the area of semantics or content of language, some things you might see, they might have difficulty following verbal directions. They might use a limited number of words. A lot of times they might struggle to understand the relationship between words, such as words in the same category, synonyms, antonyms, and they might overuse words like the word thing or stuff because specific nouns or names are difficult for them to retrieve. Now, the final area of language that we're going to discuss is use or pragmatics. And I like to think about this as social skills. The definition they give is the social effectiveness of language in achieving desired functions, rules related to the use of language in social context. So on a comprehension level, that's going to be understanding social and contextual cues. And on an expressive level, that's going to be the use of language to affect others. I like to think about also pragmatics as involving three major communication skills. So you're going to have to be able to use language, change language, and then follow rules. Using language could be things like making a greeting, appropriately informing, demanding, promising, making requests. Changing language is going to be things that you need to think about depending on who your listener is and who the situation is. So you might talk differently to a baby than you do to an adult. You might have to give background information to an unfamiliar listener, and you might have to speak differently in a classroom than on a playground with a peer and with a teacher. So changing language dependent on your listener. And then following rules for conversations and storytelling. So being able to take turns in conversation, being able to introduce topics of conversation, staying on topic, rephrasing yourself when you know that you're misunderstood and understanding that you're misunderstood, how to use verbal and nonverbal signals, how close to stand to somebody who you're speaking to, dependent on who they are and how well you know them, and how to use facial expressions and eye contact. And it's important to also note that all of these things, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, they don't usually exist just by themselves. They can, and they do, but typically a lot of the kids that you'll see are going to have difficulties in more than one of these areas, and they can be mixed in any way. You could have pragmatics and syntax, or you could have phonology and semantic deficit. You could have a semantic pragmatic deficit. It's more rare for them to exist all alone than together. Here's one more little cartoon on pragmatics that I thought was cute. And you can see this person is really not understanding what the direction is and what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so now we're going to move on from language and we're going to start talking about speech. So what is speech? Speech is a verbal means of communicating and it involves three main areas: articulation, fluency, and voice. So the first area we'll look at is articulation. Articulation deals with errors in the production of speech sounds. Well, articulation in and of itself is just the production of speech sounds, but below I've put a few different errors that are often common. On the left-hand side, the different errors are omissions, substitutions, distortions, and additions. And on the right-hand side, you can see some examples. So substitutions are really, really common. You see wabbit can can be said instead of rabbit. So what's happening is that the kiddo doesn't yet understand where to put the different articulators in order to make that R sound. So your articulators include your lips, your tongue, your palate, your vocal folds, your jaw, your teeth, all the different areas that are touched or moved in order to make a sound. And this is where sometimes there's confusion with what we talked about earlier under the area of language, and we talked about phonology. And it can be really confusing. So again, phonology really deals with language and the patterns of speech sounds, where articulation deals with how those specific sounds are made. So a kiddo with an articulation delay really just hasn't quite yet figured out where to put their articulators in order to make a sound. And a kid with a phonological or that language impairment we talked about earlier, those kids have actual deficits in the area of the patterns of how sounds are made. And that's going to be the main difference. The next area of speech is fluency. And fluency deals with the rhythm and the timing of one's speech. And when you have difficulties with the rhythm and timing, that's when you have a fluency delay or fluency disorder. One example of a fluency disorder that's common is stuttering. And I just described what stuttering is. You can read that. Stuttering has to contain tension in order for it to be a true stuttering disorder. If there's no tension, then it could just be like we call those easy disfluencies. And we all have those in our speech. Just as I'm talking, you might hear some of them when we're talking with friends. It becomes true stuttering when there's a lot of tension and awareness, and when there's an excessive amount of disfluencies. I gave you a couple examples down at the bottom. So one of those is a part word repetition and another is a sound prolongation. And those are really common with kids who do stutter. The last area of speech that we're going to talk about is voice. Voice is the sound that's produced in a person's larynx. And when you have a vocal disorder, you have problems with your quality or the use of your voice that results from disorders of your larynx. This can be with phonation, and that might make the way that it sound different. So it could sound really raspy or hoarse, or sound like someone is straining their voice. Or they could have difficulty with resonance, and that's when someone might really sound hypernasal or hyponasal because too much or not enough air may be coming through their nose or through their mouth. Different characteristics, you might have abnormal production or the absence of vocal quality, pitch, loudness, resonance, and or the duration, which is appropriate for your age or gender. In this next slide, I have a video of what normal female vocal folds look like, and then we'll take a look at what they look like when they have nodules on them. So, look at this video here. And again, this is a normal vocal folds.
Normal young female vocal cords during a stroboscopic exam.
Okay, and that's an example, again, of normal female vocal folds. And typically your vocal folds are moving so fast you can't see them. So in this, there's a strobe light that's on them in order to allow us to see the movement of those vocal folds. Now, here is a video of someone who has several different videos of people who have nodules on their vocal folds. So you'll see two little bumps or maybe one bump, and you'll be able to hear the difference in their vocal quality. You can really see how some of those sound very strained and strangled because of those nodules. All right, so here is IDEA's definition of a speech language impairment, which is really important, especially in the school districts, if anyone ends up working in a school district. And you can go ahead and pause the video and read through this on your own. And here is ASHA's definition. That's the American Speech and Hearing Association. definition, which is a little bit different from IDEAs. You can go ahead and read through that on your own as well. Here are again some different characteristics of language impairments. On the left-hand side, you see expressive language. So that's what you're able to express either verbally or not verbally. So it could be through signs, it could be through the use of an augmentative device of some sort. Those can be things like you might have difficulty with limited vocabulary, you might have incorrect grammar or syntax, you might have difficulty formulating questions or written expression. And on the right-hand side, you see receptive language, and that's comprehension, what you're able to understand. And people who have difficulty with that, they might be demonstrated by, they have difficulty following directions, they don't understand humor or figurative language, comprehending complex sentences, responding to questions appropriately, and reading comprehension. Those are just a few different characteristics or examples. Next, you see some different characteristics of a speech impairment. For articulation, you might have decreased intelligibility, so that's how well someone understands what you're saying. Sound distortions and sound substitutions. For fluency, you might have increased or decreased rate of speech. You might have a regular rhythm of speech, sound repetitions, sound prolongations. You might have blocks, and that's kind of when a sound completely stops. And that could be either at the level of your vocal folds, it could be at your lips, any different areas. You're going to have some tension and secondary behavior. Secondary behaviors are things that you can visually see when someone is having a disfluent moment. They might move their hands in a certain way, they might squint their eyes, their whole body might look like it's tensing up. That's what a secondary behavior is. And then for voice, some different characteristics. You have decreased vocal quality, hoarseness, like we saw in that video. You might have an increased or decreased volume, or hypernasality and hyponasality. Next is the prevalence of speech and language impairments. Speech and language impairment is considered a high incidence disability, and it often occurs with other disabilities. 1 in 10 people in the United States has a speech or language impairment. About 20% of children receiving special education receive services for speech and language disorders, and preschoolers with speech and language disorders represent half of all preschoolers receiving special education. Here is a pie graph that is showing the placement of students with speech and language impairments, and you can see the largest part of that pie graph represents the regular classroom. So most of these kids are just going to be in a regular general education classroom. A small chunk of them will be in a resource room. Some of them will be in a separate class, and then other is in orange, is very small. So most of these kids that you're going to see are going to be in your general classroom. Now, when we think about how someone even gets a speech or language impairment, this can be either functional or organic in nature. Functional meaning there are no obvious physical foundations, and organic meaning it's linked to a physiological defect. These impairments might be congenital, developmental, or acquired. So this might begin in the womb, it might be at birth, it might be throughout development, or it could be acquired later on in life. An example might be if someone has a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, that would be considered acquired. This next slide is about technology within individuals with speech and language impairments. We use technology a lot with children who have speech and language impairments, specifically with children who don't have a lot of verbal expression. And we're trying to get them to either speak more or to be able to let us know what they want in a very functional manner. In the picture, you can see a few different types of devices. You see that big red button, and kids might hit that to have something that they want. Maybe when they hit it, it might say bathroom, or it might say go, or it might say more, or it could even be attached to a toy, so that when they hit it, a toy starts moving or music starts playing to teach something simple like cause and effect. Or you might have something more complex, like you see up in the top of the picture, where it's an actual communication device that they're using to communicate many different things. Now, augmentative and alternative communication, that could be something as simple as using a sign or a gesture, or using a very high-tech device like the ones that you see in the picture. You could also have low-tech communication, so that could be using PECs or pictures to communicate. And the devices are often customized and should be customized to meet the unique needs of each user because not every child is going to have the same communication needs, and you really want to individualize it to each kid that you have. Now, if you have a kiddo in your classroom who is using one of these devices, whether it's high tech or low tech, and it's their way of communicating, there are a lot of different things that need to be involved. So, not just a teacher and a speech pathologist, the parents need to be involved, community members, siblings, everyone really needs to be on the same page. Everyone needs to be trained on the device. The speech and language therapist is typically the person who will set the device up for the child, but it's really a big team effort because if a child has a speech and language therapist a private speech and language therapist who sets this up, they're not going to necessarily intuitively know exactly what that child needs throughout their day at school. So you really need to be in contact with each other. Everyone on the team needs to be involved in determining what communication system is best, what types of buttons need to be on the devices in order for that child to be able to communicate in many different settings. A lot of times you'll see kids come into their classroom and their devices in their bag, or they'll go out into the community to a restaurant with their family and it's in the car. Kids who are using these devices as their primary means of communication, this is their voice. This needs to be with them at all times, just like your voice is with you at all times. It should never be stored away in a backpack. It shouldn't be left at home when you go out somewhere. It completely defeats the purpose of having these, and that's just really one big thing that we need to take home about assistive communication, is that it needs to be with the child at all times, and everybody involved with that child needs to really be helping to support their use of that communication device. And last but not least, I wanted to quickly just touch upon feeding and swallowing disorders. You're probably like, what? What is that? Somehow over the past few years, speech and language pathologists have been the ones who work with kids who have feeding and swallowing disorders. Sometimes occupational therapists will as well, and it really depends on what setting it's in and what state you're in, even what county you're in, depending on who's going to handle these types of disorders. But speech language pathologists do most of the time. And so what is a feeding or swallowing disorder? Feeding disorders involve difficulty getting ready to suck, chew, or swallow food. And swallowing disorders, also known as dysphagia, that's difficulty with the actual swallowing of food. So speech and language therapists often provide therapy in hospital settings and clinical settings. Once in a while in school districts, it's not as common in the school district because it's considered medical. And typically the speech language pathologist at a school isn't going to be working on these things, but it really depends again on the state and what their laws are. But I just wanted to kind of add this at the end as a little surprise slide because a lot of people don't know that we also deal with feeding and swallowing disorders, which is really interesting.